Hello, and welcome to Fair Trade, a Faith Unfiltered podcast series where courageous people share the candid stories of their faith journey and what brought them to Community of Christ. I'm your host, Blake Smith, and today I am here with Jeff Toone. Welcome, Jeff, and thanks so much for being with us here at Faith Unfiltered.
Hi, Blake. Thanks for inviting me on. It's good to talk with you.
So what we like to do to start off, Jeff, is to just give you a chance to introduce yourself so our listeners can get to know you a little bit better. So if you don't mind, give us an introduction like you would if you were meeting somebody for the first time.
All right. It is, so my name is Jeff Toone. I was raised in the LDS church. I was born in Utah, and my family, I have a twin sister and some older siblings, and had a really good life as a child. We moved down to southern Utah when I was 5 years old, and my dad got a job working at Zion National Park. And I'll add this in later in the story as I go, but that experience, having that outside the nature connection, and that experience getting to really love and be part of Zion National Park was a big part of my growing up. We moved when I was 5 years old, and I had a pretty stable childhood and really enjoyed my time with my family. We lived in a fairly small community, and it was predominantly LDS. And so that was really my primary experience as a child. Everything from just the involvement in church, in scouts when I got a little bit older, and my local leaders were all my neighbors, kind of that classic Utah upbringing, and a lot of good things that came with that. I really look back with a lot of fondness on my childhood and some of those memories. So as we stayed put, I went through high school in the same town. I'll mention this briefly, but as I got a little bit older, entered kind of teenage years, I went through the classic, teenage rebellion, and things that I've learned now as an adult is a very normal, very kind of developmentally appropriate experience. But me at the time, I looked around, and there were aspects of the church as I experienced it that I didn't necessarily like, things that I didn't agree with. But I will say, looking back at my younger self, they were fairly superficial things. As a teenager, I kind of distanced myself from the church, and there's some complications with the way that the church works inside families, and I keep saying the church, but the LDS church, and the way that there's expectations to be involved, there's expectations to behave in a certain way. And I definitely had a little bit of that rebellious streak. And so I had a fairly typical, not inside the LDS church, but a fairly typical teenage experience where I got in a little bit of trouble, had some fun, and learned a little bit about myself and things that I do like, things that I don't like. And ultimately, when the time came, I'm approaching graduation from high school, and the general expectation is that you're going to go on a mission, and a mission for the church. And I remember at the time, I personally was feeling a little bit kind of without a direct purpose. I wasn't quite sure what I was going to do in life. And I remember my dad talking with me, and he's like, "You've got three options. One, you can go on a mission. 2, you can go to school. 3, you can join the military." And I kind of like, well, I just dismiss all those. And I will say, I'm not going to describe everything perfectly. I do want to just caveat kind of my experience. I have a really good relationship with my family, and my dad passed away almost 10 years ago. And it was fairly unexpected for the family. He was really healthy, and we expected him to live forever. And we had just a really good relationship, the two of us. And so I deeply respected him. he had an interesting life, and it turns out that I share a lot in common with him. He was in the Marine Corps and had a really interesting life when he was younger. And I ended up kind of following a lot of the same things. And I see a lot of him in myself. So when we had this conversation, I took him seriously, and I really did want to have some kind of direction in my life. For me at the time, the idea of going on a mission was just not on the table at all. I wasn't interested, and I didn't feel like I could honestly represent myself as a believing church member wanting to go out and teach other people the gospel. And I had been going to school. I graduated high school early and then started college. I just went college classes in Southern Utah. And, but I just didn't feel like I had a lot of direction in my life. So to this day, I still don't quite remember how this came about, but something got in my mind about the Coast Guard. And there's this military branch that has kind of a different focus and different purpose than the other armed services. And I was this young teenage kid from Utah that had spent very few days near the ocean. And I got this idea in my mind. I want to join the Coast Guard. So I went through the process and I ended up joining the Coast Guard when I was 19. And that kind of is a major inflection point in my life, that I look back at that decision, and it was kind of an unknown, a little bit of a wild card. I've come to understand that the military can either be a really good thing or a really bad thing for individuals. You can go in and get some great experience and really open up some new opportunities, or you can go in and find yourself in trouble and not do good things for your future.
Great. I want to pause here for just a minute because we've gotten through school and through high school and then in the military. I wanted to ask about what time was it in your life when the rebellion started?
I was a fairly young teenager when I started hanging out with some friends that were a little more trouble than my parents would like. I was probably 13, 14. And then when I felt myself kind of distancing myself from this church identity was when I was 15, 16, in that age range. And at the time, it wasn't any... I knew so little about the doctrine. I knew so little about the history of the church. My experience and my understanding was very much kind of contained inside this very controlled bubble. And so at the time, it was mostly just this desire to kind of rebel and do things a little bit differently than I had been taught. And so I'll describe this later in the story, but this actually kind of ties in later in life with some of the things I learn and things areas where I grow and change, where I can look back on this period and see some of these common themes.
Okay, I want to ask you a couple other questions. So if I missed it, I apologize. Mm-hmm. Were you an only child? Did you have siblings?
So I was the way I'll describe it is my parents had, I have 3 older siblings, okay. 2 older sisters that are pretty, there's an 8-year gap between my 2 older sisters. And then I have 1 older brother that is, I should know this, he is 14 months older than me. And I have a twin sister. So,
okay. So even as I asked the question,
there's a group of kids right at the end.
Even as I asked the question, I realized that you did say you had a twin sister. And I knew that also, in case our listeners haven't picked up on this, we just recently did an interview with your wife, Jennifer. So people were putting the names together. So they might hear some similarities, some pieces that sound familiar to them. But I also understand that your story is different than hers. So I apologize for asking a question that I knew at least part of the answer to, but I didn't know about the other siblings. I also wanted to so when you you're going through the rebellion. You decide you're not going to do a mission. Was that similar to other young men that you were around? Were you unique in that in terms of your peers at that time?
Yeah, and this is interesting, kind of thinking about the culture. And again, this is a microcosm inside Utah culture, inside the church, and ultimately all the way down to my neighborhood. Yes, there was a lot of rebellion that was happening kind of across the board.
Okay.
Just most people did it very quietly and kind of inside the very controlled view, where I would hang out with a group of people, and that following Sunday, some of them would be up in front of the congregation blessing and passing the sacrament. And to an extent, that was me as well, initially, kind of when I was on the younger side. And even as I grew into adulthood and eventually moved out of my parents' house, moved in with friends, even then I was still connected with the church. I would still go out to my parents' house and go to church with them on Sundays. So it's interesting for me just thinking back on that period of my life where mentally I wasn't invested, and I had kind of separated myself, but then performatively I still had to be there and wanted to not disappoint my parents, and to an extent, still maintain this image. But we'll talk about this as well. But I got tattoos, and those kind of things are hard to hide up. They're hard to keep from family,
Right.
and that kind of shatters a lot of expectations as a young 18-year-old in Southern Utah.
So were you in the priesthood as a young man?
I was. So the way that the LDS Church kind of breaks up the priesthood into two primary groups, with the Aaronic priesthood, which is typically given to the teenagers, starting at 12 years old. It's a deacon, teacher, priest, and I had been ordained to each of those different offices, ordained to a priest when I was 16. And that's after that time is really when I kind of separated myself. The expectation would have been that as I prepared to go on a mission at 19, and that age has changed since this point, but as I had prepared to go on a mission, then I would have been ordained as an elder in the Melchizedek priesthood.
Okay.
And so at that age, before I ended up joining the Coast Guard and kind of moving on in that part of my life, I was really not involved in the church, and I did not advance in the priesthood and become an elder. So that was another kind of distinguishing aspect where a lot of my friends, they became elders and they served missions, which can be a great opportunity too. And it's, they got to have an experience where they went out into the world, whether it's to a foreign country or to another place where they've never been. And then I did the same, just in the Coast Guard, and it was kind of different opportunities, but different ways to grow.
That's great. Did you mention that you graduated early from high school?
Mm-hmm.
And
Correct.
Were you just super advanced, or?
I don't think so. And I laugh a little bit because this is kind of a funny contradiction in my experience. When I was younger and a very straight-laced, good Mormon kid, I struggled in school. I didn't enjoy it. My grades weren't terrible, but they weren't great either. And about the same time that I started, doing things that I'm not supposed to and kind of rebelling, for whatever reason, that helped me focus, and I kind of engaged back in school, and I did really well from that point forward. And essentially, that was my high school experience. In high school, I was able to really stay engaged. Now, I wasn't a super high achiever. I had a child that is one of those high achievers, and that was not me. And I will mention Jennifer. She is a very high achiever as well. And so for my case, I did all the things I was supposed to. I completed all my classes, and I was able to graduate early. And for me, that was fantastic. I was really excited to graduate early. I was still 17 at the time, but I was working. I was working as a lifeguard, and I had been for several years. And that was the job that I really enjoyed, getting to learn some of the life-saving aspects and the training. And it was something that I ended up carrying forward into the rest of my life. But it was a great opportunity for me as a teenager to have some real responsibility and to have that purpose in my life. So I was able to graduate early and continue working, and eventually to move out. And I mentioned my twin sister earlier. I do want to bring her up again as well. So my parents, when they had myself, my twin sister, my brother, I mentioned, was only 14 months older than us. So within 14 months, they had 3 kids.
Wow.
And, as a parent, I am shocked that they survived that, because I feel like my hands are full, and, we have a lot of kids as well, but our kids were spread out a little bit more. And so I was really, really close with my brother and with my twin sister, and we have still maintained just an incredible relationship. I'm not a really social person, and my brother has always been one of my best friends, and my dad as well has always been one of my best friends. My twin sister, we are polar opposites in so many ways. Our personalities, the things that we enjoy, the things we're good at. But even then, we've still been just really, really close. And she is someone that has managed to step into my life in just the right time, in just the right place, at different points in my life, to really, really affect me and really help kind of guide me in important ways. I'll tell a story now that relates to some of these transitions where my twin sister played a really critical role. And at the time, I placed a lot of significance on this. So I mentioned that I had gone through this rebellion and was not living a good life in the sense that, I wasn't doing all of the right things. My family was worried about me, and they wanted me to straighten up, to go on a mission, to do all these good things. And I remember one day I was at my apartment with my roommates. We were all friends, and she came and knocked on the door, and I was completely not expecting her at all. And so I go to the door and answer the door, and I start a conversation with her. And as we get into the conversation, she kind of just tells me, she's like, "I think you need to come home." And she was just inviting me to, like, you can leave all this, you can come home. And she had the best of intentions. And in my mind, I remember thinking and saying the words no. Like, no, I'm not going to go home. But I physically said yes. I was like, and it just, kind of just overcame me. I was like, oh, okay. And so that was something that I hadn't expected. And at the time, and then going forward, I kind of viewed that as a miracle. That was something that I felt like it didn't come from me. And it ended up having a pretty significant, change in my life. And I've since recontextualized some things, and so we'll talk about that as we go. But that was this kind of really critical point in my life where my sister reaching out to me as someone who loved me and wanted the best for me was just trying to help. And it was that small little action that got me to step back and to kind of reconsider what it was that I wanted. And with that in mind, what am I going to do to make a good life for myself and ultimately to be a good person? I've felt like I've always been a good person, even when I wasn't doing the right things. I was still a good person, and I just felt like I needed to find a way to grow, and that wasn't a path that was going to turn me into the person I wanted to be. So I've always appreciated her taking that risk, because I cannot imagine how uncomfortable that was for her to come and
Had to been,
try to talk me back, you know.
It shows
But
her deep
ultimately,
love for you. Yeah,
it helped change my life.
that's great. That's great. What a neat story. I've always heard stories about special connection between twins, and so it's
And
really
there's more to come. There's more connection,
okay.
I'll
All
tell
right.
you.
Well, I'm looking forward to it. So you graduated early. You have turned down mission. You've gone to the Coast Guard. Pick it up from there, and let's hear some more.
Yeah. So this was a really exciting time for me. Up until that point, you know, my family, we never had a lot of money. We were comfortable. We had what we needed through hard work. You know, my dad and my mom were both just incredibly hardworking people. But we didn't get to do a lot of traveling. We went on some family trips when I was younger. Went to California once, and actually a couple times, and went to Yellowstone. My family had a tradition that when anyone graduates high school, they go on a trip to Hawaii, and that was the big trip. Other than that, and I'm thankful for all of those trips. That still was significant to me. But we didn't get to do a lot beyond that. And so joining the Coast Guard, that was a brand new adventure. That was something that was completely outside of my known experience, and was such a radical shift in everything that I had experienced so far. I went through it's called MEPS, the Military Entrance Program, something. I forget what the last one is. But it's the entrance program where you go through all the medical, physical before you are accepted and assigned to boot camp with whichever service you're going into. And that was up in Salt Lake. And from there, the boot camp for the Coast Guard was in Cape May, New Jersey. And so I packed up my bags. I get on an airplane. My parents took me to the airport, and I get on the airplane by myself and head off to New Jersey. And this was in January of 2003. And I show up to boot camp, and I don't know a single person within 1,000 miles of me. And you get off the bus in the middle of the night, and it's the classic movie scene. They come on screaming and yelling, and it begins immediately. It was an interesting experience. I met some really good friends in boot camp. It's kind of a bonding experience when you're going through something difficult. And I remember a couple of things I'll mention while I was there. It was a really cold winter. There were some really big snowstorms that came through the East Coast, and we spent days and days and days shoveling snow. A lot of our marches, our military drills were all in the snow. We had to go to the rifle range in the snow and load ammunition with cold hands, and it was difficult, but really good experience. And so after finishing boot camp, my first assignment was on an icebreaker that was stationed out of Seattle, Washington. And that, again, was another new experience. I had never been to Seattle. I knew very little about the Northwest, and about being a sailor and getting to go work on this icebreaker. And this was an incredible experience. At the time I was 19, hadn't been 20 years old yet. But I moved up to Seattle and worked on the ship. It was docked in Seattle for about 6 months while I was there, while the ship was getting retrofitted, while I was getting some repairs, and planning for the next deployment, which was to Antarctica. And that was something that was not in my plan. And, you know, I didn't grow up as a kid thinking I want to go to Antarctica. But I mentioned earlier that I spent a lot of time outside. My childhood was in a good way, kind of a feral childhood. I got to go explore mountains and, you know, just be back before dark. And so I have always just loved nature. And having the chance to go to Antarctica was absolutely incredible. It was a 6-month deployment. We went down through Hawaii and Australia, Hobart, Tasmania, and then from there down to Antarctica, to McMurdo, which is a scientific base on Ross Island. And the whole purpose of this deployment for Icebreaker to go down there is that we go down and we break an open water channel through the ice from wherever the ice begins that season all the way into the base at McMurdo. And once we open that channel, then we escort a tank ship and a freight ship in that resupplies the base for the next year. And in addition, we bring on a bunch of scientists. So we have our own scientists, which are with the Coast Guard on board, but then we also brought on National Science Foundation scientists, marine biologists. We had an aviation detachment, so we had a helicopter crew. And so I got to fly in helicopters out to icebergs and out to these uninhabited islands. There was one time where we were flown on a helicopter out to this island, and it was a drop point for 55-gallon drums of jet fuel that they were going to use later in the voyage for refueling the helicopters. And so it was a whole day where I got to be on this island with just a couple other people, and we're on an island off the coast of Antarctica, and we would have an hour between the flights, and we would get to just go explore. And there was this huge penguin rookery that was down below this cliff that we were above. And so just seeing that kind of wildlife and that kind of nature and being that far away from civilization and having that kind of experience, it was deeply spiritual to me. And not in the religious aspect, it was deeply spiritual to have that opportunity to just kind of tangibly feel and experience this beautiful world in a way that's kind of untouched by humans, with the exception of us. And having that chance to kind of have that firsthand experience with the wild aspect of this world in this extreme environment was just really moving. And those type of experiences have been an important part of my own kind of journey. And we'll talk about that as we kind of get into faith. But that's one of the important memories for me. So we spent a couple months down in Antarctica, and we were there during the southern summer. So we got to the ice edge on Christmas Eve, which was pretty cool. And we broke ice, got into McMurdo. We had some ice leaves, so we got to get off on the ice and play football and take pictures of the penguins. And then when we were in McMurdo, there's a trail that they have designated. You have to be really careful about staying on the trail because if you wander off into these ice fields, you can fall into a crevice and get injured or killed. But myself and some friends, we got to bring our snowboards. And so I got to go snowboarding in Antarctica. It's a lot of really, really cool, fun experiences. And ultimately from there, as we wrapped up that part of the trip, I will mention one more thing is while we were down in Antarctica, I was a non-rate at the time. So just kind of that entry level, beginning into the military. I was able to temporarily be reassigned to the Marine Science group. And so while we were there, I got to be involved with a lot of the data collection, the marine biology sample collections. And so I got a little bit of the taste and exposure into the marine science side. And so during that experience, as we're working our way back up to Seattle, I put in my paperwork to go to the Marine Science Technician School for the Coast Guard. So that was going to be my rating. So I get back to Seattle, spent a little bit of time at home back in Utah, and then from there went back to back to Yorktown, Virginia, for training to become a Marine Science Technician. And I'm sorry, I need to go back one step because this will relate back into my faith journey. So I've given kind of my story about how I separated myself from the church, and I really didn't want to have anything to do with the church. as I was leaving for boot camp, my neighbor and one of my friends' dad and my bishop, so this is all the same person, he gave me a Book of Mormon, and he wrote a testimony in the front cover. Just talked about how this is a book that had helped him and given him so much strength over the years, and that he wanted me to have that as I go off into this world. So I had the Book of Mormon with me, and so as I'm up in Seattle, and again, it's going back a little bit, I was homesick. I was still a young kid, being really truly away from home for the first time, and I remember I've always been into history, and I love reading history, learning history, and I remember just in my room one day, kind of wishing I had something to read, some history to read. And I remembered, oh, I've got this Book of Mormon. I could read that as if it were history. And so I pulled it out and started reading and had some good feelings. And ultimately, I looked up where the LDS Church, I'm forgetting the name of the group. It was a student ward that was associated with the University of Washington. That was the closest kind of young adult group to where I was. And so I started going back to church and met some interesting people. And that was kind of my first little connection of kind of reigniting my belief and my connection with my childhood faith. And so then from there, I go on this deployment down to Antarctica, and I'm battling myself the whole time. Because when you get outside the country, when we got to Australia, the drinking age, for example, the drinking age was 18. And so I remember just having these battles with myself of I'm committing myself back to the church. And I want to make all these good decisions. But I'm still a young kid, and I've got all these friends, and I want to drink. I want to have these fun experiences. And I remember in Australia, I would go out and, when we had shore leave, I would go out and go drinking with my friends and come back and just feel so terrible. I felt like I had failed myself and failed my parents and failed my religion and failed God, and, just really, really hard on myself for making what I felt were these horrible decisions. So as that trip is wrapping up, when we got back to Hawaii on the way back to Seattle, I remember going to the beach with some friends, and they were drinking, and I just made the decision. I was like, I think I'm done. I'm done with that. I'm gonna really commit, and I'm gonna do this church thing correctly. So that was the last time I had touched any alcohol, and so that was kind of that transition as I was trying to recommit back to the LDS Church. So that kind of sets the stage as we move forward. So with all that said, I go home, and I will mention some of your listeners. I know that there's a lot of crossover with former LDS members integrating into the community of Christ. So I'm sure a lot of people will recognize this. But after I got back from Seattle, before I went back to Virginia, I went home and had a little bit of time on leave with my family. And I coordinated with my bishop and with the stake president, the other congressional leader, or the other leader, priesthood leader there, to get my patriarchal blessing. And so I was, that's usually something that is done when you're 14, 15, 16. And so I was an adult at this time, and it felt really special, really meaningful to me. And at the same time, I was ordained an elder by my dad. So my dad ordained me an elder. And, there's worthiness standards that you have to meet in order to do that. And I felt like I was in a good place and was doing the right things. And so it was exciting for me to feel some of these connections and to feel like I was doing the right thing. So from there, I go back to Yorktown, Virginia, and that is another area that is so incredibly dense with history. There's a lot of Revolutionary War history. And I will mention, before any of us, the European descendant people, ever touched these shores, it was already an incredible place with incredible history and incredible people. But from kind of my lived experience, we've got the Revolutionary War. There are battlegrounds from the Revolutionary War and the Civil War. And it's been incredibly well preserved over the years. And the Coast Guard base at Yorktown, Virginia is literally just on the other side of a gate from these historical battlefields. And you're right on the Chesapeake Bay, and there's just so much history that happens right there. And I was being, this newly reformed, good LDS kid. And I just really enjoyed that time. After I would get done with my classes, I could go ride my bike on these paths that go through these battlefields. And it is very reminiscent, and this was special to me at the time. It still is for that matter, but it was very reminiscent in my mind of the Sacred Grove, of the experience that Joseph Smith talked about, of going to the woods to find peace and to find clarity. And I remember riding my bike and finding this grove of trees that was away from the path. It was just totally quiet and peaceful, and praying and just really feeling this confirmation that I'm doing the right thing. And just another kind of moment that helped really tie me and bond me back to the church. So I finished my training in Yorktown, Virginia. And Jennifer mentioned in her podcast, I was so glad I got to listen to the first half. She talked about
cheating, Jeff. You can't.
I know. She talked about at that moment how I performed really well in school in this training, and I was at the top of the list for getting to choose our next assignments. And the way the military works a lot of the time is that even if you get to choose, it's still just a request. I was hoping and saying, these are my top priorities. I want to either go to San Francisco Bay or up to Portland, which it turns out I learned later after meeting Jennifer that she grew up in the Bay Area, and that's kind of her stomping grounds. But she was at the same time debating whether or not she's going to go up to Portland. And it was kind of neat for us to think about the possibility that it could have been that either way we would have met each other. Regardless of where we had gone. So I ended up getting assigned to San Francisco, and I moved back across the country again, and I get stationed at Coast Guard Island. It's a small island between Alameda, which is a small island in the bay, and Oakland. And I loved my time there. I really enjoyed the area. Actually, looking back in my teenage years, I dreamed of moving to California. For some reason, California had always just stuck in my mind. I felt, even though I was a Utah kid, I felt like I was a California native, and that's what I wanted to do. So I was pretty happy to be in California, and I genuinely did love it when I moved here. So I start my time here in Alameda on Coast Guard Island, and just from the work perspective, I initially started as a port state control inspector, which was just doing security inspections on foreign ships when they come into port, and just making sure that they're in compliance with all the U.S. laws, all the international maritime laws. And so that was a really neat experience. I'd had the time on the icebreaker learning about ships. They're complicated machines, and there's a lot that's involved. And so I got to kind of use some of that knowledge as I advanced into this job. And During that time, I found the local LDS congregation again. It was another one of the young single adult wards. And I started attending there, made some really good friends. One of my roommates who was in the Coast Guard, that was not, who was not LDS, knew almost nothing about the church. He became a friend, the two of us became friends, and I invited him to go to some of our activities, and he just got involved and kind of got brought into this circle of friends. And I kind of worked on him, and over time, he decided to be baptized into the church, and I got to baptize him, and that was something that felt really good for me. I felt like I was making a big difference in his life, giving him this opportunity, and we'll kind of explore this as we go on. But I absolutely was a literal believer. I believed with everything that I was that this was the right thing, and I had the truth. And it's something that I've had to nuance myself away from over the years. So he joined the church, and eventually, and this is where Jennifer and I, where our paths finally crossed. She showed up in our ward one day, and I remember looking up, seeing the choir up on the stand singing, and I knew everybody up there, but then there was this one girl. Like, who is that? I don't recognize her. And so it was, I got to meet her, and she talks about that in her story, and has a much more refined memory than I do, because she remembers so many details, and I struggle with some of the details.
I was going to say, do you remember the story the way she told it? Because I know that my wife and I both tell our meeting story differently.
No, I do. So it's funny, and I can talk about this a little bit later as well, but one thing that I learned a lot about psychology over the years, and the fallibility of memory, and the way that we're always continuously reconstructing our own memories,
right,
with the best of intentions, right? But regardless, I do have still a very strong memory of when I actually got to meet her, and we were at it's called the Linger Longer after church, where we had a chance to just eat food and kind of hang out with these other people our age. And I remember doing everything I could to try to get her attention, to try to get close enough to her to have some kind of interaction with her. And
even making all your friends get up and move, I understand.
That's exactly it. I very, very much remember sitting in the chairs, and because I was watching her, just hoping to have this moment, when she got close enough and was looking like, oh, I guess there's not a chair, I was like, wait a second. And I asked all my friends to move down. I wasn't going to move. They all needed to move so that the seat next to me was open. And so that was that kind of first moment where we really got to begin this whole new journey.
Great story.
So it was great meeting her, and she, in every good way, she kind of completed this aspiration that I had. I mentioned before, I'm recommitting to the church. I am trying to do all the right things, and so as she described, we did not have a long engagement. We did not have a long dating period. It was all very rapid.
Now, she said that it was long in Mormon
context, yes,
in the LDS church context.
Correct.
But it did seem pretty quick.
So, and it's funny, I've got my own version of kind of this rebellious tendency, and she does as well. And she is so much a rule follower, and wants to make sure that in the best way she can that she's not causing trouble and going against the system. But on the other hand, she absolutely has this fire, and she is not interested in being this classic cliche Mormon. And that has served her well and serves me well and our whole family. So that's an aspect of her personality that I absolutely love. And has induced so much change in me. So we are very different people with very different personalities and different hobbies, different interests, and at the same time, we are so compatible, and we've been so good for each other over these years. And so having that moment to kind of cross paths and begin this early in the relationship, but then quickly turning into this realization that we wanted to be together. And so as she described, it's in the big picture, it was a very fast engagement. It was a very fast relationship, and we quickly decided that we wanted to get married. Life was very busy at the time. For me, she mentioned, I'll try not to rehash too much of the story, but I did get assigned back to Charleston, South Carolina for a couple months. I went to a federal law enforcement training center where I got some training because I was transitioning in my job to the Sea Marshal group it was at the time stationed in Coast Guard Island as well. And this was a group that was formed post 9/11 that would go out and board foreign commercial ships out at sea as they were making their way into U.S. waters. And so that was another aspect of my experience in the Coast Guard that was exciting. It was kind of this fast action, getting involved in law enforcement, learning about all of the laws and how to protect people's civil rights, which I think is such a critical thing. And I'll mention that, now with this little taste of law enforcement that I had in the Coast Guard, it's hard for me to square where I see some of the law enforcement now. And such a significant part of the training that I received was all about protecting people's civil rights and knowing what our limitations are. And so that's just a little contrast now that I'm seeing that is hard to reckon with. But it was a great experience. And I spent the last couple years of my service in the Coast Guard as a Sea Marshal, and got some leadership opportunity. And personally, I excelled. I really enjoyed my time, and I did really well. And again, made some lifetime friends and have maintained those relationships. And at the same time was starting this new relationship with Jennifer. And we got married while I was in the Coast Guard and while she was a teacher. And we thought life was so hard. And, as a young couple, looking back on it, obviously that was one of the easiest moments of our lives, because, everything going forward is going to get more and more difficult. But it was a great opportunity. And so that kind of catches us up with where Jennifer and I get married. And I begin to kind of start making plans for the next step. And between the two of us, we had both kind of talked about, the possibility of, do I stay in the Coast Guard and make it a career? There's benefits to that. You can retire after 20 years. Some of the drawbacks that we saw was that we wanted to have a family. We wanted to start having kids, but that would mean that we would be, every 4 years, we'd have to pack up our life and move somewhere else. And that we both kind of felt like that would be difficult, to be disruptive for the kids. So we made the decision that I was going to get out, and I was going to go to school at CSU Monterey Bay and pursue, at the time, my plan was to pursue marine biology, and something that kind of had this experience with the Coast Guard as a marine science technician, and some of these opportunities, I wanted to just continue that on into my formal education. And so as I finished my time with the Coast Guard and Jennifer finished her school year, we then moved, and everything happened all at once. And we talked about, of all the major life events, moving, starting college. We were newlyweds still at that point, having a baby. We did everything except for a death in the family. And we felt like everything just kind of collapsed all at once. And it was really challenging to make that kind of a massive transition.
I'm going to pause you right there because it sounds like we're about to transition into some new stuff. And I'm going to tell our listeners they're going to have to catch us in the next part of this episode to hear how this story continues and finishes for you, Jeff. So I want to thank you for being with me here for this part. And again, listeners, we hope you are enjoying this and will join us next time for part 2 of this Fair Trade episode with Jeff Toone. Thank you for being with us, and we will see you next time.
Thank you so much, Blake.